what is your book about?
Yeah. First, thank you for inviting me, for asking me to do this, and thank you for your work, really telling our stories. African stories really haven't really been told well. But to come to your question, how would I describe this to a fisherman? That's interesting because I write about fishermen in my book. So thanks for using that as a way to think of this. So my book is really trying to think about, so we are Africans, Africa has really been at the center of our world when we think of media. Take, for example, I come from Nigeria where oil is produced in this process that causes a lot of devastation to the environment. And from there, it goes to power some of our devices that we use today. In a place like the Congo, coltan that powers our cell phones, are produced. And then when these cell phones, computers, and other media devices, when they are done with their life, where do they end up? Many of them end up in places like Ghana, like Wilusha in Ghana. They end up in places like Lagos, Nigeria, where they are reused, where they are opened up to retrieve things from that. So Africa is really at the center of our media world. But when you look at discourses on media studies, a field called media studies, or in environmental studies, environmental humanities, we've not done, these fields haven't done much to capture Africa's centrality. The way that, Africans and the environment really power our world. That's a simple way to think of it. So my book is a way to really draw attention using images, using visual culture, film, photographs, arts, to show how Africans, and their land have really been central to the ways that the world moves. And so what I try to capture in the book then is one, the ways that Africa is central to these processes. Number two, what this means for African people and environment. The way that Africans in the Niger Delta of Nigeria, for instance, don't have access to their land in the same way anymore. The land is not good for farming anymore. The fishermen can't get fish from the water anymore. They have to go farther into the ocean because of pollution from oil. So I'm trying to show artworks really dealing with all these problems. Yeah, so that's really the center. Well, that's really what's at the center of the book.
Take me through the biography of the book, from the conception of the idea, the research that you conducted, the writing, the beauty of the writing, or the challenges of writing,
Yes.
and politics of publishing.
Yes.
And now that the book is out, how is it doing its rounds? So just take me through that biography.
Okay, yeah, I like that. Yeah, so yeah, the book came out of, so I did the first book. This is the second book for me. I did the first book on African literature and environmental issues, which came out of a dissertation I did at Michigan State, working with Kenneth Harrow. Ken Harrow works on film. So in working with Ken on a book on a project on literature, it was really, there was this strong interest. I had this strong interest in, film because of my mentor I was working with. And there is a joke that you go to Michigan State to work with Ken on literature and you end up a film scholar. And I'm like, you know what? I'm going to be the exception. I'm going to work on literature. But as I started working on that first project, I was starting to see films that were really dealing with the kind of issues I was interested in. Then when I finished and when I graduated, I went to University of Alabama where my first job. A colleague of mine sent me the images of Fabrice Montero, whose work is on the cover of the book, the stunning images, and said, "This is ecology is here." So at that point, I was working on the first book. Then I realized that I think I have two book projects here. So this book really came out of thinking for the first book. But in this case, instead of working on literature, and instead of trying to combine them, I'm not doing justice to either of them. So I decided to separate them. So this is a result of that separation. So it came out of earlier research. And then the fact that, as you probably know, it's just this vibrant visual material dealing with Africa these days. And we've not really done justice to them. The vibrant literature coming from Africa is getting a lot of attention. But the visual culture is not doing the same thing. So I want, especially by scholars. So I wanted to do justice to those images, while and also because they're not just stunning, they are also powerful conveyors of aesthetic form, but also of political issues. So the book came about, really, I'm trying to address that. That introduced a challenge because I wasn't trained to do this kind of work. I'm a reader, I'm a close reader of literature, but I don't really see myself as a scholar of visual culture. So that was, I came to the project with some excitement, but fear, and trepidation about what am I going to do? How am I going to do this? So it took a lot of reading, reading and reading, and at some point, I felt comfortable enough to start writing, and then sharing work with people, and they're like, oh, there's something here, and those the feedback in the release got me thinking. So got me motivated to keep writing. So the research and part of what is exciting about the book for me, but also daunting, especially at the writing stage, is the fact that I'm working across disciplines. It is media studies, it is environmental humanities, which I know well, but it is also visual culture, film studies, and trying to really read across these fields and master these fields enough to say some to contribute to the scholarship and the debates in there. So that was really the challenging. That was really a challenging aspect of the book. There are five chapters in the book, informed by these different fields I've talked about. In my introduction, I talked about that my method. I titled that section "In Praise of Indiscipline," because there's really no disciplinary method that the book coheres around. It's a book, and it's a book that is appropriately a second book, because there is no dissertation advisor, looking over your shoulder, trying to rein you in. So it's good, in that sense. So just to give a little flavor of the book, I have, there is a chapter on oil extraction in Niger Delta, as I've mentioned. There's a chapter dealing with electronic waste in Ghana that also includes a documentary film on waste from a banana plantation in Cameroon. Um, I have a chapter looking at cities, urban spaces, as a kind of ecological archive in Africa, looking at Johannesburg, but also Lagos, Nigeria. There is also a chapter where I'm thinking of conservation. I'm thinking of conservation and race. And in that chapter, I bring the dead Cecil the lion killed in Zimbabwe, within around the time that the Black Lives Matter activism was really at the height. So I'm talking about what does it mean for these two images to circulate and collide at the same time. Images from Cecil the lion and from Black Lives Matter in the US. So these are the kind of things that I do in the book. The book came out late last year, early this year. But I was talking to my editor last night. I've been pleased with what when you write a book and you don't know what it's going to happen to it. It's really done. It's done well. People have picked it up. People have picked it up across fields. Even though it's primarily for African scholars, African studies, but I've been pleased to see it on syllabi, people working in media studies in different parts of the world. So it's done well in that regard, Scholars I respect have written to me saying, that this is a good book, and I don't take their encouragement for granted. And and in terms of awards too, it's also done well. Gotten some awards. It's a finalist for the ASA Book Prize, which we announced tonight. But whatever happens tonight, but most importantly, to be included among these great books in the field. It's really good.
What surprised you the most after you had done with the research?
I would say that what was the most surprising thing is really the way that, even though early on I knew that Africa has really been the center of our world, but I did not anticipate how much of these resources that go back to Africa directly or indirectly. So tracing the global supply chain of media, and the way that Africa is really central, whether it's the material resources I mentioned at the beginning, or shipping things, shipping media devices, or even, dumping of waste. Yeah, I think what surprised me the most was really how, the way that Africa has been central to this. And the fact that I didn't also, when I started the book, another challenge I thought I was going to have is I'm like, I don't know that, I don't know that there's enough material on ecology, visual culture to do a full book when I started. But finishing the research, I was blown away that if in fact I didn't even do everything. I couldn't even do it all. And since the book has gone to press and published, people keep sending me stuff on the kind of materials that will be relevant, that will fit the work. So so the other thing that's been surprising is how much is out there on this on how much is there in terms of material, but how little work or non-existent is scholarship, on these materials, and especially when it concerns Africa.
What contribution do you think the book has made on media study, environmental study, the visual culture,
Yes.
in African studies in general?
Yes. Yeah. So thank you for that. I think in media studies, the book has really brought, the book is making a statement, that we need to rethink our consumption of media to really put Africa at the center. Africa is a marginal field, it's a marginal location. So its contribution is now we have to think of Africa differently. In fact, earlier this week on Monday, I got news that the book had won a prize. It's called, Margaret Spout Award from the International Studies Association, from their environmental studies section. And part of the letter is to say, that they would like to have a conversation around the book at their conference in Montreal in next year. And they really, because they think this is a challenge for them to rethink their conception of environmental politics, and things like that. And so this book is coming to these fields that haven't thought about Africa or this kind of materials in this way, and it's challenging the conventions and the common sense of this field. So that I think that's one challenge. That is one thing that the book offers. That's what the book offers Africa. That it offers to media studies. The environmental humanities too is a similar project of centering Africa and African cultural materials. And when you center, it's not just bringing Africa to the center. The kind of questions you ask and your answer also begins to change. In media studies, for instance, there is this issue of digital labor. It's a concept, and people are talking about what is happening on the internet. The shiny work on the internet, YouTube, answering surveys and as different kinds of digital labor, free labor. But I'm like, why are we thinking about the shiny work on the internet without thinking seriously of the materiality, the hardware, and other components? When we bring question of materiality into the conversation, when we bring the hardware into the conversation, we realize that we can't separate the digital and the hard labor, or whatever I want to call it. So there are different ways that the book is thinking. And for African studies, I think, it pushes, environmental studies is strong in African studies, but it's really been the sciences and the social sciences often. So that this pushes that the environmental, that the humanities as much to contribute to, that these creative artists, these creative producers, they are, producers of knowledge. They are theorizing, environmental solutions in their work. And we need to take them seriously as we think about environmental futures in Africa. So that's really what this book brings, to African studies. I'm interested in ways that, the way that these visual cultures allow us to put Africa in conversation with the diaspora, that will begin to think of an expanded sense of African studies. I mentioned earlier the chapter where I'm looking at Sister the Lion and then the Black Lives Matter. And the idea, part of what I'm doing there is to create this, dialogue across diaspora that foregrounds questions of precarity, vulnerability, and race. One of the arguments I'm making is that it's the same logic of disposability that makes it possible for someone to go to Zimbabwe with or without a license to kill a lion. It's a differences. We can nuance it a little bit more, but there are really similarities between that logic of disposability and the logic that makes it possible to, to take a black life really in the Americas without consequences per se. So I think there's this similar logic of disposability that brings, this animal life and black lives together in ways that I think, are interesting. So I try to do, so the book, does in many ways try to bring Africa back to its, to this, bring Africa back to conversation with the diaspora. And finally, the other contribution I think the book makes is this idea that I think about in my epilogue, this notion of imperfect media. And I'm talking about the ways that because of scarcity in Africa, we have found ways of producing forms, objects with low carbon expenditure. We know now that we can't continue to blow, to expand carbon, so put carbon into the atmosphere the way we've been doing. So part of what I'm arguing is that Africa actually provides a model. Because filmmakers in Africa, for example, they are making do with so little. They are producing great work with so little resources that they offer a model of a kind of imperfect media. It's not shiny, but it's beautiful in its way, and then it's impactful in its way. And I'm talking, like the great Ngugi wa Thiong'o talked about poor media, poor media theory. He's talking about the ways that the improvisation of performances and stage development in Kenya, because the theater lacked the kind of infrastructures that you find in conventional, the ways, so this make do, making do with little. And I think so. I'm like, I don't want to romanticize poverty, we should address poverty, but I'm saying that, but that the climate of scarcity in Africa opens space, offers a window for thinking of our planetary futures, because we're all heading towards scarcity in terms of, the climate, in terms of environment. But Africa, we have lessons to learn from Africa in that way. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.